Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome to Aesthetic Imaging Video Tutorials. This episode might seem a little familiar if you've seen my first ever tutorial that I put out. Going back, I didn't really like the way it turned out, and now we have a new setup. This is going to be a different technique than what we used in that first one, so even if you saw it, this is still going to be different. Here we have our scene set on a cork board, and our time lapse is being put onto this piece of paper that is pinned to the cork board. And then we have some little sticky notes on the side here that can add to our scene. Alright, so let's get started on this. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is create a new composition. We can either go to this little icon or click on New Composition here, or Composition, New Composition, or hit Command N. The options are limited, but many. All right, so we're going to start off by calling this main comp, and let's set this to maybe 23.976, 1920 by 1080, and 10 seconds is fine. All right, so let's hit OK. So now we have our blank composition. First thing we're going to do is go over to our assets, and we're going to pull in this corkboard albedo. And we're just going to add that in there. And what we want to do is scale this down. So it's maybe about yay big. Now obviously we want to fill in the blank areas here. So what we can do, let's maybe bump this up a little bit more. Something like that, I guess. Alright, so what we can do is go over to Effects and Presets, and we can type in Motion Tile. So we're going to add that on top, and we're going to change the output width and output height. Now, the nice thing about this texture that we're using is that it is repeatable and seamless. So let's maybe bump up the height just a little bit. So we want it just basically to fill in the edges here. And we will actually be changing this in the future, but we gotta do all the other stuff before we determine how much we want this to be. All right, so now we have our cork board. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna Shift Command C to pre-compose this. We're gonna call this corkboard BG for background. How about that? And we want to make sure that Move All Attributes into New Composition is selected, and hit OK. Now, one thing about the motion tile is that it can be very taxing on your computer. It's a big old memory hog. All right, let's set the preview to half. All right, so now let's start building up our scene even more. So let's bring in our paper texture. Bring that in. Drop that down in there. Just make sure it gets into the center. And of course, move that above our corkboard. And we're going to hit S and scale that down. And we'll make it maybe about that big. Now you notice that this is a piece of paper with pins in it. So what we're doing is we're basically separating all of our components of this scene. It actually makes it a lot easier to composite in. So now we have our paper texture in here. So let's make sure that our paper texture is selected, and let's hit Command D to duplicate it, or go up to Edit, Duplicate. All right, so we're going to hide our top layer here, and we're going to select our bottom one, and we're going to go back over to Effects and Presets, and we're going to type in Fill. So it's under Generate, Fill. Let's add that on top of our bottom paper texture. And in fact, let's select this, hit Enter, and let's rename this to Paper Shadow. So for this fill, let's select our corkboard, and then go in here and bring down the brightness and the saturation. That way it gets a little bit of the color tone of the corkboard, seeing how the shadow is going to be on the corkboard. All right, so now what we want to do is add a fast box blur. Fast box blur, make sure that edge pixels or repeat edge pixels is selected. And let's just bump this up till we get a nice little soft edge here. Maybe 13, 14 will do. All right, let's turn our top paper texture back on. And what we're going to do is select our paper shadow, make sure our move tool is selected. So hit V, or you can go up here, selection tool. All right, and we're going to actually use the arrow keys to just bump this a little bit to the right and down. Something like that. All right, so now what we want to do, it's a little too pronounced there. So let's hit T to bring up the opacity. And let's turn that down to something like 450-ish. Yeah, we kind of want to match the shadows from our pins being cast here. And that looks about right. All right, so let's go back into our project window and let's add our time lapse on top of our paper. And hit S, scale that down. Now you notice this is 1920 by 1080. A little too big for our paper. All right, so let's find a nice position where we want our focus to be for our time lapse. So probably the river here. So let's take this, let's move it over so that the river is kind of in the center. And it just kind of works out that we have our border on this side as well. Let's bump that over just a little bit. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take our rectangle tool and we're going to create a mask to about here. We want to kind of match the border. All right, so let's go to our mask 1 here and switch this from add to subtract. And we can move this over a bit. Again, trying to match up the border. All right, that looks fine to me. So now what we want to do is get our pins back. So the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to turn off the visibility for our time lapse. And we just want to come in here, making sure that we're still on our time lapse layer. And we just want to come into these pins, maybe get up nice and close, maybe pull this down. Let's grab our pen tool up here. We can click on this or we can hit G. And let's start outlining these pins here. So I'm basically just following the curvature. And when you get to a corner like this, like a sharper corner, you can hit Alt or Option, and you can move the handle individually. So let's move it over to here. And let's bring this out. And if you want, you can move it in closer like this. Hit Alt or Option. We can change the handle there and then just close that path. All right, so let's turn this back on. And here we go. Pull this back up. And this mask 2, it's going to be set to add. We want to change that to subtract. Now you can feather it if you want. So we can hit F. And let's maybe bring up the feather. I don't really like it with the feather. Maybe 1 pixel. All right, so now let's go ahead and do that for all of our pins. If you have a mask that is kind of hard to see, you can actually just go to here and change the color to something more visible. All right, so let's fit this back up to 100%. And now we have our pins visible. Remember, all these masks should be set to subtract in order to get this to work. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our paper texture again, Command D, move that above our Bowman's Hill Tower, and we're actually going to set this to multiply. Now what this is going to do is bring some of our shadows back in here, so you can actually see the shadow of our pins are back here. All right, so let's add a curves to our paper texture. And let's drop that on top of here. And let's brighten this up a bit. Brighten up the actual paper, and let's darken down the shadows. All right, so you might notice that, let's say from here to here is a smaller gap, but only slightly, than this gap right here. It kind of bulges, the paper kind of bulges out like that, and then comes back in. Yeah, I mean, it's not as noticeable anywhere else, but here's how we can fix that. Let's take our Bowman's Hill Tower. Let's Shift Command C to pre-compose this, and we'll call this Timelapse PC for pre-composition. And we can go up to our puppet pin tool here. And the first thing we're going to do is actually put little pins at each of the corners, all the parts that we don't want to move. So actually around these pins as well. All right, so now let's add a point right about here. And let's take that and move it over just a bit till it matches up with our paper a little bit better. This one maybe comes in just a little bit, just ever so slightly. Maybe bring this down just a bit. This part as well. You don't want to move it too much because then it will, obviously distort the image. All right, so that's it for that. And one thing you want to do is make sure, like if you move your playhead and then decide, oh, you know what? I want to move this. This is actually a little too much, which it wasn't. It's going to create a new keyframe. So that means you're going to have a little bit of animation. You don't want that. So if you do make any movements, make sure that you are in line with all your other keyframes. All right, so let's delete that because we didn't need it anyway. And by the way, I hit U to bring up the keyframes. All right, so now let's start adding our movement. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go to Layer, New, Null Object, and we're going to create a new null object, and we're going to take all of these, all of our layers, and we're going to take this pick whip here, and we're going to connect it to the null. So that way, when we move our null, all of our layers move with it. All right, so let's hit enter and rename this to camera movement. All right, so just like in the example, we're going to have the camera kind of rotate and pull in. And that effect is achieved by, well, let's first hit R and then hit Shift S to bring up the scale and rotation. Let's go about halfway to 5 seconds here. And let's add keyframes to our scale and rotation. And this is going to be the end of the move. Maybe let's bring this in a little bit more. So the camera moving in and out is going to be achieved with your scale. If you scale it up, it's like the camera is moving closer. If you scale it down, the camera is moving further away. Bring that nice and close like this. And that's our last keyframe. All right, so now let's go to the beginning. And let's set the rotation. Maybe rotate it this way. So negative 10 degrees, we'll call it. And for our scale, let's pull that out. Get a nice wide view. All right, so let's play this back. There we go. We have our nice movement. Now, we want to kind of ease into this last position, and we want to ease out of this first position. So we're going to select both of our keyframes here, and right-click, go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. Now we can also go into our graph editor here, and you'll notice that we have these, if you're on value graph, which most of the time you want to try to use value graph over speed graph. I think it's just easier to handle. So here we have these curved lines, and this is our movement. So what we can do is select our last keyframes, and we're going to bring up some handles, and we can pull that out. maybe go to our first keyframes, pull this out even more, and you'll notice our curve gets a little bit sharper here in the center. So as it's leaving this first position, it's kind of slowly building up to that movement. In the center, it's going at its fastest, and then it's going to slow back down until it comes to a nice stop. All right, so let's play this back. That might be a little too much on the easing, so let's just dial it back a little bit here. Pull these handles further in. All right, let's check this out. There we go. That's nice. All right, so now we want to add some extra camera movement here, especially after it stops. It just kind of gets boring and it's just sitting there. So what we're going to do is add more of a handheld feel. We're going to do that by hitting P as in position and A as in anchor point. So P and then Shift A. Now what we're going to do is add a wiggle expression to both our position and anchor point. So we're going to Alt click on the stopwatch and let's type in wiggle parentheses, and we're going to type in two numbers. The first being the frequency, or how many times a second, and the second one is going to be the value of how much it's going to change. So let's put something like 0.7 comma 10. And then for our position, Alt click, and we're going to type in wiggle parentheses, maybe 0.5 and 7. You kind of want to vary up your wiggles just to get a little more randomness to it. All right, so let's play this back, see what it looks like. All right, that is either the person holding the camera is drunk or they're on a boat. Either way, that's a little too much. It's a little too fast and a little too furious. I mean, much. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to change this to maybe 0.5, and we'll do 5. And we'll change this 0.5 to 0.43. And set this to maybe 4. Now, the thing I've noticed, like while the camera is moving in and rotating, the wiggle's not that apparent. The time when it becomes really apparent is when the camera is standing still. We're not making that move, at least. All right, so let's check that out. We can actually do, let's bring this up to 0.5 as well. Maybe 0.6. All right, that's a little better. You can always mess around with all these different values, get the look that you want. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Our corkboard is no longer filling our screen. So what we need to do is go back in here and set our output width and height. So let's go to our main comp here. Let's click on this lock, and then let's double click on our corkboard background. Now you see we have two compositions up here. We can take our corkboard, move it to the corner or the edge here when it becomes purple, and now we can have a side by side. So what we're going to do is start bumping this up a bit. Now if you notice, nothing is happening as we're moving this up. We're at 280, we're at 110, 140. Nothing is happening. It's broken. Let's go into our main comp here. We're going to click on our toggle switches and modes until you see this type of screen. And there's this little icon right here, collapse transformations. Let's click on that for the corkboard. And now our motion tile will carry through into our comp. All right, so let's go back into our corkboard, and we need to bump up the height just a little bit. We got a little corner showing. And boom, just like that. All right, so let's go back to our main comp after we've unlocked everything. And we just want to make sure that no black edges or blank edges are visible. Because remember, the quote unquote camera is moving. And we look to be good. Awesome. I'm thinking, oh, look at that. We got a couple frames missing of our time lapse. All right, so let's go to where it's visible. Hit N to shorten our comp to that. And let's just go to composition, trim comp to work area, and that will trim everything nice and neat. There we go. So this edge of our photo, I'm not really digging it too much. So let's go to our time lapse. Let's go to our effects and presets, and let's type in roughen edges. So we're going to add roughen edges to our time lapse, and let's bump this up so you can actually see what's going on here. As you can see, it is roughening the edges. Now we're not doing that. That's too much. But what we do want is to bring our scale down, like really far, something like 10, the lowest you can go. How about that? Edge sharpness, let's turn that down just a little bit. And our border, we're actually going to bring down, like way down. We don't want this obvious edge. But what we're going to do, we're going to set this to maybe 3. And as you can see, it just breaks it up just enough to make it a little more believable that it's part of a photo or on paper. Yeah, something like that. You can mess around with some of these settings, see what you like. Just enough to give it a little extraness. It's a word, I'm sure. All right, so our scene is looking a little bare. So let's add some more elements. I'm not sure when this happened, but our project window disappeared. If that ever happens, you can go into Window, and here's our project window. Just open that back up. So in our assets, we have a couple sticky notes here. Let's bring in our first one. And let's hit S to scale that down. And we want to match the size of our pins here. Something like that. All right, let's move this over. And one thing that can really help bring this together to make it feel like this time lapse really is on this piece of paper is just have some elements overlapping. And of course, what we want to do is take our sticky note, duplicate it, and we'll call this SOD. The really cool kids will know exactly what this is in reference to. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this SOD note. So actually, we want to rename this to SOD note shadow and SOD note. How about that? All right, let's hide this. And what we're actually going to do, instead of going through and creating new effects, let's go to our paper texture shadow, go to the effects, and let's select both of these, hit Command C to copy, and let's just paste that onto our note. Turn our top one back on, and let's just bump the shadow over here, and we're going to hit T to bring up the opacity, and we're going to bring this down to about 50, maybe a little less. There we go, something like that. So what we can do is actually take these and pre-compose them, call them SOD note comp. So that way, all we have to do is pick whip this one layer to our camera movement. So that way, it moves with our camera. So of course, we can do that for the rest of our notes here. All right, so as you can see, adding these little elements here kind of fills out your scene and also serves the purpose of kind of bringing it all together. Maybe we can adjust our scale here at the beginning. So we're zooming out a little bit more, or zooming in a little bit more. Of course, go to your corkboard, and what was that? Was that the top? Yep. Go to output height, raise that up a bit. There we go. All right, so one thing maybe we want to do is take our last movement here, U. So take our last keyframes, maybe move them to 4 seconds. Now what we're going to do, if you noticed in the demo, our time-lapse was kind of a still image and then turned into a time-lapse. All right, so we're going to do that by, we're going to duplicate our time-lapse PC. So Command D. So now we have 2 copies of that. Now our bottom copy, we're going to right click, go to Time, and click on Freeze Frame. And then we can actually cut that by hitting Shift Command D, and that will split it in 2. Let's call this bottom one Still. And then our top time-lapse PC, we can just leave that as is. And let's move this just so it's just slightly overlapping. Let's hit T. So we're going to go and set a keyframe right here at 100. And at the beginning of the clip, we're going to set this to 0. So that way it's a little less of a harsh, like abrupt start. All right, so maybe for our starting rotation, let's bring that down a little bit by bringing it up. Maybe to -7. And then let's zoom in a little bit to start as well. Just a little bit. There we go. That looks great. All right, so that's basically it for today's tutorial. Now I'm gonna kind of give you guys a heads up on what's gonna be happening very soon. I am currently working on a revamp, a complete revamp of this channel. It's gonna be a new look, a new feel to the tutorials. So what's gonna happen is next week, there's gonna be a video kind of detailing all the changes that's gonna be made, what I initially intended on this channel being, and the vision that I had for it, and how the new changes will be more in line with that vision. After next week, I'm going to be taking 2 weeks off from doing tutorials, and what I'm going to be doing in that time is focusing on shooting like short sketches and stuff for new tutorials. I'm going to be working on finishing up some asset packs and presets and stuff like that that I've been working on that I haven't gotten a chance to, and actually this corkboard texture that we used today is actually from a PBR material pack that is going to be released. So that's going to be for like 3D workflows and stuff like that, and obviously you can use it for other stuff. I currently have a sky replacement pack up on Gumroad that you guys can check out if you want. But yeah, we're going to be adding some more assets and presets for, you know, Photoshop, After Effects, stuff like that. And after that 2 weeks is done, we're going to go back to making tutorials, and it's going to be better. And you're going to learn more, and you're going to be more entertained. All right, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys for a tutorial in 3 weeks.